Hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great Player. Well, let me start by offering an apology for last week's Sorcerer video. Now, once I released it, the comments started coming in, and I could see a lot of comments that said that I had missed the point of the Sorcerer and that wild magic wasn't their only shtick, and that there were more facets to the Sorcerer than I had perhaps discovered or discussed in my video. There were comments about perhaps my focus too much on wild magic would skew the entire perception of the class. And so I went back to the Player's Handbook for 5th edition and reread the class. Now, my apology is that I had not done that for the first video. I had based my experience of players who had played sorcerers in my campaigns and my feelings towards those, and the way that they had played them and portrayed them was the only genuine source that I had actually worked from. I hadn't gone back to the book, and it's that kind of arrogance that I hate. No one should feel that they are above returning to the source material, above doing research, learning and discovering, and I had not done that for the Sorcerer, so I apologize. I was arrogant in thinking that I had experienced all that there is to experience simply because I've been role-playing for so long. That was completely and utterly disrespectful of you as the viewer. Now, you have no idea what having you watch my videos means to me personally, and I realized that I had not done what I should have, which was return to the source material, so I apologize for that. Having said that, I have now returned to the source material in the PHB and looked at the Sorcerer class again with new eyes, trying to see what it was that I had missed. Now, yes, wild magic is definitely there, and it is definitely a component of the Sorcerer. But that's one type of build that the Sorcerer can go with. The other type, and I know with expansion books there are more types that have been made available, are a draconic history. Now, what this does is it makes me step back and look at the Sorcerer and go, well, is there more to it than perhaps I had initially thought? The spell list of the Sorcerer is still very limited, and their Sorcerer points, their abilities that they have to enhance spells, to extend spells, to increase the damage of spells, but also to potentially cast more spells and to get back from discarding spells, makes them a lot more of an interesting class from a mechanical shifting perspective. However, when you read the description of the Sorcerer, the focus in the text is on the backstory. How did the Sorcerer get their powers, and what do they feel about those powers now? And there was a strong hinting, and not even a hinting, there was direct sentences. Does your Sorcerer enjoy the powers they have? So what that does is, and if you look at the other classes, there's not that much focus on the attitude of the character to their class. It's assumed wizards became wizards because they studied, warriors became warriors because they learned how to fight, and it was done voluntarily. With the Sorcerer, it's indicated in the book itself that sometimes this is not a chosen career path. This is something that has been thrust upon the Sorcerer by bloodline, by heritage, by a random encounter with a fae, who knows? And that's part of what being a sorcerer is about, is to discover and to write that encounter that caused the Sorcerer to get their powers in the first place. So what this means, of course, is that I immediately sit up, because when a character class is based on its story rather than on its mechanics, that for me gets me very, very excited. Now, when you look at the Sorcerer, they are just a deviation of the Wizard. They are just a deviation of the Mage. They can cast the same spells that the Mages can, with a restriction of certain spells. Now, when you look at the spell list that the Sorcerer has access to versus the spell list that a Wizard has access to, basically all they've done is they've taken all the cool spells and given those to the Sorcerer and left the Wizard with things like Unseen Servant and Tenser's Floating Disc. Now, the argument is that the Sorcerer has a limited access to spells. Yes, a limited access to all the cool spells, not to the interesting spells that the Wizard then gets. So let's forget about that differentiator. Whether the sorcerer can cast all the wizard spells or only a few of the wizard spells that are just the cool ones, it doesn't matter. They can cast arcane power. They can enhance that power, they can increase the number of spells they have, they can decrease the number of spells they have, they can really, really work and manipulate those spells how they want. And mechanically that leads us down a different type of garden path to creating this ultimate sorcerer who's re-rolling all of their damage rolls. It becomes a very technical class, and obviously I'm not going to talk about that. But the different lineages, the different ways in which the sorcerer gained their power is where I find it most interesting and where I think I did the sorcerer a disservice last week. So the narrative of how the sorcerer got their powers is, and for me, is the most important thing. And then what they do with them. The book even indicates that some sorcerers are reluctant to use those powers. And so if you look at the weaponry and the equipment that the sorcerer has access to, they don't have any armor, of course, but they've got things like crossbows. That speaks to the fact that the sorcerer might live this double life. That there is this, maybe I am a sorcerer, but I don't want to be. I don't like the power that's within me. I'm the seventh son of the seventh son, and every seventh son of a seventh son gets these uncontrollable powers which flow through us because a millennia ago our mother was seduced by a dragon, and the dragon conceived a child, and that child was the seventh son of my mother and father, and then every seventh son. So that story becomes very, very interesting. And the sorcerer's journey of coming to terms with that power, of embracing that power, or of trying to remove that power and then realizing that they actually can't because it's fundamental to who they are, that becomes a very, very interesting role-playing perspective. And that starts to give the sorcerer a lot more color, a lot more flavor than perhaps we normally would have associated, certainly what I did last week. So when we look at the merits of the sorcerer now with new eyes, the sorcerer has the ability to really adapt their spells from a purely mechanical perspective. There's nothing in there that says that they can change their spells from one type of magic to another type, or they can change the effect of the spell. They can change the numerical outcomes of the spells. That's fine. Range, duration, damage, etc., etc., etc. So the merits are that they don't have to just take what's written in the book. They can push it to a new level. They can extend it to a new level. So that means that they can be a very effective damage dealing class. They can be a very effective ranged assault type of class, which is an interesting space for the sorcerers to be in, because oftentimes, yes, they might be able to do lots of damage, but they're usually at the back, staying away from those kind of conflicts. The sorcerer, because they can do more, they can go further, they can etc., etc., becomes almost like the sniping class, if you like, where they are there, they are attacking the enemy, doing lots of damage. They then have this amazing backstory, which needs to be developed and it needs to be fleshed out. Now, I have seen some comments where people say, oh, I don't write a backstory. I discover the backstory. That's a perfectly valid approach to have. However, if you are not an active player, if you're not actively discovering your backstory, then it just means that you didn't create a backstory and you don't care about the character. So with the sorcerer, I think you have to create a backstory, because it's that backstory that's going to drive and motivate the sorcerer on their journey. If they embrace their heritage, how are they embracing their heritage? Do they start to study the dragon ways as the one type of build? They can automatically speak Draconic and read Draconic and that kind of thing. So do they start to embrace it? Do they start to practice dragon traditions? Which then begs the question, what are the dragon traditions and those kind of things? You'll have to ask your GM. Your GM will hopefully have watched last week's video on how to make dragons epic and cool. But aside from that, you will have to create this interesting backstory and look at how does your character accept this burden. And that, for me, is one of the greatest merits, is what is your character doing with this power, let alone all of the other mechanical things that get attached to that. Now, what of course are the negatives? Well, the negatives are this relatively limited field of view in terms of what magic powers they have access to. Yes, it's limited, but it's not hugely limited. Not at least from what I could see when I was reading through the books again. So the powers that you have access to are not as diverse as what a mage might have. You have this almost double personality here. You've got, on one hand, amazing role-playing opportunities with this wonderful, wonderful lineage story, with this dealing with this magic that's coursing through your body. The book describes a mage whose veins are so saturated with magic that they have to release it, or they feel as if they're going to burst. There's that wonderful, wonderful storytelling, and then there's this very clinical, mathematical change. And now, again, I know I seem to be harping on the fact that it's a mechanical class as well as a narrative class. And that, for me, is the weirdest space to be in, because if you're playing this class, this role-playing class that's got all of this backstory that's really, really cool, to then step into combat, and now suddenly most of your powers, or half, or however many it is, you now then step into combat and you suddenly go, oh, I've got sorcery slots. These sorcery points, they allow me to either enhance a spell, to cast another spell at this point, or if I spend 2. So it starts to then change combat into this very number heavy space where you're busy balancing the amount of spell slots and spell points that you have, and enhancing spells. It gets double range, or it does more damage. You reroll your damage point. That, for me, is a very strange duality of very strong narrative and then very strong mechanics. I almost don't know of any other class, well, not almost don't know of any other class, I don't know of any other class that has as a mechanic heavy space where you are literally exchanging numbers to get your dice up higher and lower, etc., etc. Most characters, the numbers are almost predetermined and you move forward. So that's a dynamism that one doesn't often see, and that you're going to have to balance, because if during combat you just become this number crunching, oh, I'm going to spend a spell sorcery points that I can extend the range of my spell now travels 400 feet, so I can hit them before I see them, type of thing. You need to narratively work that in my opinion, if you're going to bring together these two different worlds to create a single character that isn't just this flat space of number crunching. Oh yes, and I've got a lineage which I haven't written because I don't want to prescribe my character's background. I think you're going to need that to make the character feel holistic. So the potentials that the character then has is to be this amazing long-range sniping, damage-dealing class that really has some nice backstory to them. Your pitfall would be if you were to make them, oh, they're a loner type. Traditionally, characters that have got tremendous power that they didn't want, that they don't like, that maybe they do want, they crave, but they gave up everything else for it, all those kind of things. Just watch any of the X-Men movies. Well, at least the ones made in the 2000s by Bryan Singer with Professor X as Patrick Stewart. Those movies deal with people who have these powers thrust upon them and don't want them. Generally, that makes them isolationist. Wolverine was a major isolationist who, in the first film, joined temporarily and then left and then came back, and he had a narrative imperative to remain with the group. They needed him in the movie, so he had to keep coming back. You have to make sure that if you're creating this sorcerer who's frustrated with the world and who has bursts of magic which they use to destroy the world, or they get angry and they lose control, and that angsty space is fantastic, but they need to find solace, they need to find acceptance in the party that you're traveling with so that they will continue to travel with the party. And you need to make sure that feisty, defiant, I don't want to talk about it, release magic, I still don't want to talk. You need to find a balance where your character confides in the other player characters to make sure that you become integral into that group, rather than being the mysterious, oh, I have powers and I'm not going to talk about it type of character. So that's something that you need to really reconcile if you're going to make your character work. Now, we then look at the different builds that you can have, and I know that in subsequent expansion books and editions, they've added on different types of lineage stories, so it's not just draconic or wild magic, there's all kinds of other things that have been added, and that adds flavor to the character, absolutely. Again, though, fundamentally, it comes back to that origin story. What is that origin story? Now, again, the origin story is, I think, something that definitely differentiates the sorcerer class from the other classes insofar as it's so integral to that sorcerer's story. Now, you look at a paladin's backstory could be anything that led them up to the point where they swore allegiance to a specific god. Same as a cleric, a wizard. Again, any backstory would lead them to the point where they studied magic and they started to use magic. With the sorcerer, there is this definite line. If it's inherited, if it's a bloodline, that means it's been with them since they were born. If it's a random contact with a creature or an event, exposure to nucleonic radiation, whatever you want to call it, that's a specific moment that makes it really interesting. And so the types of sorcerers that you get, generally speaking, will depend on that build line. And that means you've got to buy different books. And I'm not a huge fan of advocating that you must buy 50 novels, 50 rule books in order to be able to play a specific class. So if we look at the two that are presented in the PHB, it's a dragon lineage or it's the wild magic lineage. Those two are what you have to work with. And that does, to a large degree, limit the sorcerer to their backstories, that they have to have these two events that have occurred. And that means that there's not a huge amount of difference. And because the spells are limited in terms of what the sorcerer has access to, again, that just narrows it down to this is a specific type of build. So you're really limited to the denialist. I don't like my powers, I don't want to use my powers, but in a situation, a crisis situation, oh, I cast magic shield. And don't attack me, don't let me release, oh, and off go the magic missiles. So there's the denialist, there's the embracer. I am of dragon descent and I have scales on certain areas of my body. I will become dragon. I will only speak in draconic. I will eat what dragons ate. I will look for a horde. I will embrace my dragon lineage and try and be the dragon that I have inside of me. So the denialist or the embracer, or maybe someone in between who is reluctant to use their powers but uses their powers. I suppose you could go with, again, this is dependent on what sort of magics you're wanting to focus on. You could go with an entertainer who pretends that it's illusionary magic and not in the traditional wizard sense of illusion, but as in sleight of hand, tricky magic. But they are actually using their magic because it just naturally came to them. They're not a scholar. They don't have to research all that stuff like the wizards do. So maybe that's another build that you could go with. Again, though, with the limited spell choice, you're not having access to things like Unseen Servant, which you could use in a magic act as the I'm raising the curtains now. Unseen Servant, lift up the curtain, etc., etc. Again, though, that's for you to explore and to try and uncover. But again, it's about bringing together the dichotomy of the class, the mechanics plus the narrative. So from a story perspective, the story, of course, is discovering or exploring your character's evolution, how your character changes from the first time we meet them to the last session of the last game. And really, for me, the sorcerer is the one who has an inbuilt narrative that describes this journey. Do they embrace their lineage? Do they wholeheartedly want to follow this line, or do they rebel against it and eventually accept it later on? If they're embracing it, it needs to let them down at some point. It needs to reveal itself as having this darker tone. And your character will go on this amazing journey from denialist or acceptor all the way through to eventually getting to a point, hopefully, where they've achieved a balance between who they are and what they have inherited or what they have been imbued with. That, for me, is the pinnacle of where the character should be. So when you're playing the character, if that's your ultimate goal, if your ultimate goal is to have your character get to the end game, get to the final big bad boss battle, and have your character have a fundamental change, it should be to bring balance to them as a character, which prescribes an imbalance at the beginning of the game. That's how you design a story arc. Is your final point, what is the exact opposite of that final point? That is an imbalance. if you're seeking balance. So the imbalance then is where you want to start the game, and that you'll go on this journey of finding balance. How that expresses itself, how that unfolds, that's up to you and the game master to explore and to decide upon. But that's your journey that immediately prescribes itself for this class, which, again, the more I read about it, the more I find it interesting. Would I play one myself personally? I've always been a traditionalist when it comes to wizards. But this story journey that's prescribed, or that seems to be prescribed, I kind of like. I think it's pretty damn cool. So the next time I play a character, I can assure you it won't be a monk, but maybe it will be a sorcerer. So I hope that you accept my apology, that you see what I'm talking about in terms of the sorcerer, and that you give the sorcerer a chance. Don't do what I did and tar them with the same brush that the players that you've experienced have done. Rather, experience them for yourself, explore them, and see what that narrative journey is like. And if you're unsure of how to do a character backstory and how to do a character journey, there are videos on this channel on how to do that. But the sorcerer is also a good class to practice with, because they have some pretty cool stuff, and they allow you to go on that journey and to almost see that journey happening in a prescribed manner. The other classes, they don't have too much of a prescription in terms of where they should end up and how they should start, so that's more open for you to interpret. The sorcerer is right and nice, on par with what a good character journey should be, and it's right there for you to take. So I hope you like this video. I hope you hit that subscribe button if you aren't already a member of the legions of role players that subscribe to the How to Be a Great GM channel. And again, thank you all for being part of this channel and for making your comments and making me aware that we must always strive to understand our games better before we simply dismiss components of them outright. Until next time, I wish you and yours the very happiest of playing.